He believed he was picking up signals from Mars.
A tower stood on a Long Island bluff for 14 years, and for most of that time, 3 men knew things about it that nobody else did. Not secret agents. Not saboteurs. A bookkeeper, a machinist, and an engineer. And when the truth about what happened at that tower finally surfaced, it didn't come from a whistleblower or a smuggled tape. It came from paper. Ordinary, mundane, unglamorous paper. And from the inventor himself, writing calmly under his own name, 16 years after the fact, in a magazine anyone could buy off a newsstand. That inventor was Nikola Tesla. The tower was Wardenclyffe. And the story that has spread across the internet for the past decade, the one with a secret female engineer, a deathbed tape recording, and a cover-up ordered from the shadows, is not the story the record supports. The real story is stranger, sadder, and considerably more human, and it was told, piece by piece, by the men who were actually standing there. Let's start with the place itself, because it's easy to forget how strange it must have looked. In the early 1900s, Shoreham, New York was little more than potato fields, scrub pine, and a scattering of families who measured their nights by the sound of the tide. Then a wooden tower rose out of the bluff, nearly 200 feet of octagonal timber lattice, built with almost no metal in its frame, topped by a massive steel dome that could catch the sun so sharply it hurt to look at. Farmers used it to find their way home in the dark. Sailors on Long Island Sound used it as a landmark before it was even finished. And on certain nights in the summer and fall of 1903, that dome came alive. People walked out of their houses to watch. They stood in doorways and in wet grass with their heads tipped back, watching a corona of light gather around the top of the structure. Not a flash, not a beam, but something that held and pulsed the way lightning never does, because real lightning is gone before your eyes can register it. Witnesses reached for the only vocabulary they had, which was weather vocabulary. Sheet lightning, a crown of fire, a hum that some said they felt in their chest before they heard it in their ears. Afterward, there was a smell drifting down off the bluff, the sharp, clean, metallic smell that usually follows a thunderstorm, except there had been no storm. The sky had been clear. Something was happening up there. That much has never been in dispute. What has been endlessly disputed, and increasingly mythologized, is why. Here is where the internet version of this story usually begins, with a young woman, an anonymous engineer working quietly at Tesla's side in a field where nobody else was watching. In the popular retelling, she sees light bulbs glow with no wire feeding them, she's sworn to secrecy, her name is scrubbed from every photograph and payroll record that survives, and decades later, alone in the winter of 1957, she finally speaks into a borrowed tape recorder before she dies. It's a good story. It has the shape of a good story, a hidden witness, a decades-long silence, a confession just before the end. But there is no such tape. No estate sale, no archive, no chain of custody, no transcript that predates the internet age in which this legend actually began circulating. It is a modern invention, and it carries a structural flaw that should make anyone pause. A witness who cannot be named and cannot be checked can be made to say absolutely anything, because nobody can ever push back. The men who were actually at Wardenclyffe left something far less dramatic and far more valuable. They left paper. George Scherff was Tesla's secretary and bookkeeper for decades, and his surviving correspondence is one of the richest sources historians have on Tesla's day-to-day working life, precisely because it is so unglamorous. Scherff wrote about wages that couldn't be met, about suppliers who wouldn't extend credit any further, about the grinding arithmetic of running an experimental laboratory on borrowed time. Coleman Cheeto was Tesla's machinist and assistant, present through the Colorado Springs experiments and later at Wardenclyffe, the man who physically operated the switches and watched the discharges from a closer distance than almost anyone alive. Fritz Lowenstein was an engineer who worked alongside Tesla in both locations and went on to a genuinely significant career of his own, holding important patents in vacuum tube technology. He was not a mystic chasing visions. He was a working engineer who happened to be standing in the room when history was being made, or at least attempted. None of these 3 men, in anything that survives from them, describes suppression. None mentions agents in the tree line, none describes a switch thrown back in fear of what might be revealed. What they describe instead is a project that ran out of money in the most ordinary way imaginable. And to understand why it ran out of money, you have to understand who Tesla was actually working for, and what he had promised them. Tesla arrived in New York in 1884, with almost nothing but a letter of introduction and a solution to a problem that had defeated the era's best engineers. Thomas Edison's direct current could not travel far without bleeding away as heat, which meant electrifying a country under Edison's system required a power station roughly every mile, a plan that was never going to scale. Tesla's alternating current, driven by a motor built around a rotating magnetic field, could travel across vast distances with little loss. George Westinghouse backed the idea, the physics settled the argument, and in 1895 the Niagara Falls power station began sending Tesla's polyphase alternating current more than 20 miles to Buffalo. That moment is arguably the true birth of the modern electrical grid, and it made Tesla, for a brief window, one of the most celebrated inventors in America. It also gave him an idea he could never let go of. In June 1900, Century magazine published a long essay by Tesla titled The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, part engineering paper, part philosophy, part manifesto. Buried inside, it was the proposal that would consume the rest of his life. Tesla wanted to transmit not just signals, but actual electrical power, without wires, using the Earth itself as a conductor and the upper atmosphere as a return path. He believed the planet had its own natural resonant frequency, and that if you fed energy into the ground at exactly that frequency, you could draw usable power back out almost anywhere on the surface with a properly tuned receiver. Wardenclyffe was meant to be the proof of that idea. Construction began in 1901 on land connected to a New York financier named James Warden, which is where the site got its name. Tesla hired Stanford White, the most fashionable architect in America, to design the brick laboratory at the base, a building that still stands on the property today. But the tower was the actual point of the whole enterprise, and beneath it sat a detail that almost never makes it into the shorter retellings. A shaft driven roughly 120 feet straight down, lined with iron pipe reaching outward to the water table. A shaft that deep and that expensive makes no sense for a simple wireless telegraph relay. It only makes sense if the tower was designed to push energy into the earth, not just broadcast signals into the air. Tesla himself wrote about needing what he called a firm grip on the earth. Not contact, a grip, and that single word, repeated in his own writing, tells you almost everything about what he actually believed he was building. So why did the funding paperwork describe Wardenclyffe as a wireless telegraphy station? Because that is what Tesla told his backer he was building, and his backer was the most consequential financier in American history. John Pierpont Morgan did not fund curiosities, he funded control. By 1901 he had already consolidated the American steel industry into the world's first billion-dollar corporation and reorganized the nation's railways. Tesla approached him seeking backing for a transatlantic wireless telegraphy system, and Morgan advanced roughly $150,000, several million in today's terms, in exchange for a controlling interest in the relevant patents. Then two things happened almost simultaneously. In December 1901, Guglielmo Marconi reported receiving a faint transatlantic signal at Signal Hill in Newfoundland, sent from Cornwall using far cheaper equipment than Tesla's. Whether Marconi's reception was genuine has been debated ever since, but commercially it didn't matter. The world believed him, and he had beaten Tesla to the milestone Tesla had promised Morgan he would reach first. At almost the same moment, Tesla quietly began expanding the scope of what he was building, going back to Morgan describing a larger, more ambitious project and asking for more money. The surviving correspondence between the two men across 1902 and 1903 is a painful read, because you can watch a professional relationship fall apart in real time through increasingly formal language. Tesla wrote long, pleading letters, at one point asking Morgan whether he could name a single other man capable of offering what Tesla was offering. Morgan's replies grew shorter and colder. He had committed a specific sum for a specific stated purpose, and he was not interested in that purpose changing after the fact. By 1903, his answer was final, and no further money came. It is worth being precise here, because this is exactly where the popular legend jumps its rails. There is no surviving document in which Morgan declares that free energy would destroy his business interests and must be buried. What exists is a financier declining to keep pouring money into a project that had already missed its commercial window and had quietly changed its goals without his approval. That is the boring, well-documented version. And the boring version rested for 16 years on an assumption nobody had actually verified, that Morgan had been told the truth about what he was funding. Then, in 1919, Tesla removed that assumption himself. At 63 years old, with Wardenclyffe long gone and Morgan 6 years dead, Tesla agreed to serialize his life story in Electrical Experimenter, a popular magazine aimed at radio hobbyists and boys building crystal sets on kitchen tables, later collected and published as My Inventions. Across most of those installments, Tesla is doing exactly what you'd expect from a man protecting his legacy. Polishing the legend, recounting his childhood visions, describing the flash of insight that supposedly came to him in a Budapest park. But when he reaches the subject of Wardenclyffe, the polishing stops. He states plainly that when he approached Morgan, he did not disclose the true nature of what he intended to build. He describes the actual plan as the wireless transmission of power itself, and acknowledges, in his own words, that this was never what his backer had agreed to fund. That single admission resolves the entire mystery without requiring a hidden tape or an anonymous source. Tesla undersold the project to secure the money, then discovered he could not deliver what he had actually promised on the budget Morgan had approved, then asked for more money to fund a project his backer had never agreed to in the first place, and was refused by a man with every ordinary commercial reason to refuse him. Nobody needed to suppress anything. It collapsed the way overambitious ventures usually collapse, quietly, through unpaid invoices and drifting employees, rather than through any dramatic intervention. But that only explains why the money stopped. It doesn't explain what those men actually watched happening on the nights the tower fired. For that, you have to travel 4 years earlier, to a wooden barn on a plateau outside Colorado Springs, where Tesla built an experimental station in 1899 and kept a diary of everything that happened inside it. A diary that survives today as a technical document rather than a memoir, which makes it far more trustworthy than any second-hand legend. In it, Tesla describes producing artificial lightning discharges over 100 feet long, with thunder audible for miles. He describes sparks jumping from the bare earth to the boots of anyone who walked too close to the building, and butterflies caught in the charged field circling with their wings trailing faint light. During one thunderstorm moving away across the plains, he noticed something else. The electrical readings from his equipment didn't simply fade with distance the way they should have. They rose and fell in a pattern as the storm retreated, as if the disturbance were traveling through the earth, reflecting off some distant boundary, and returning to form a standing wave, the way a plucked string settles into fixed points. If that were true, the earth wasn't just an inert conductor. It was a resonant body with its own natural frequency, and energy fed into it at exactly the right rhythm could accumulate instead of simply dissipating. Remarkably, Tesla wasn't wrong about that part. In 1952, the German physicist Winfried Otto Schumann calculated on theoretical grounds that the cavity between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere should sustain standing electromagnetic waves with a fundamental frequency near 7.83 Hz. Those Schumann resonances were later detected and are still measured continuously today, sustained mainly by the roughly 50 lightning flashes striking somewhere on the planet every second. Tesla's intuition that the Earth and its atmosphere form a genuine resonant cavity was vindicated, nearly 50 years after he first claimed it and 9 years after his death. What the Schumann resonances do not do is validate the power transmission system Tesla actually tried to build. The energies involved in those natural resonances are tiny, the frequencies involved are nowhere near what Tesla was generating at Wardenclyffe, and no physicist since has found a workable path from a resonant cavity to genuine wireless delivery of usable power at any meaningful scale. Long-distance wireless power transmission is real research today, but it uses tightly focused microwave or laser beams, and it is directional, metered, and expensive, nothing like the free, planet-wide broadcast Tesla envisioned. The honest verdict, supported by everything that survives, is that Tesla was decades ahead of his time on the underlying principle and, so far as anyone has ever demonstrated, mistaken about the engineering required to turn that principle into a functioning system. Being right about a principle does not pay a machinist's wages, and by 1905 Wardenclyffe was effectively finished, its debts unpaid, Tesla's interest in the land already mortgaged to cover bills at the Waldorf Astoria, where he had been living. In 1917, with America now at war and real anxiety spreading about unmonitored wireless installations along the Atlantic coast, the property's creditors moved to liquidate what remained. Workmen arrived to take the tower down and initially couldn't. Stanford White's timber frame had been engineered to withstand Atlantic storms, pegged and braced and tied into itself so thoroughly that saws alone couldn't bring it down. Explosives eventually did. The great lattice that had lit the sky over Shoreham 14 years earlier collapsed into the scrub it had risen from, and the brick laboratory at its base was left standing, quietly, for the next century. Tesla lived another 26 years after that demolition, still publishing, still giving interviews, still holding birthday press conferences to announce new devices. He was never silenced, only increasingly disbelieved. He died alone on January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, having spent his final years moving between hotels as bills accumulated, feeding pigeons in Bryant Park. Within days, federal officials from the Office of Alien Property took possession of his papers and belongings, despite his having been a naturalized American citizen since 1891. The examination was conducted by John G. Trump, a respected MIT electrical engineer, who concluded that the vast majority of the material was speculative and philosophical rather than technically exploitable, and contained nothing of significant military value. That conclusion has never fully satisfied historians, partly because of how quickly officials moved to seize the effects of a private citizen, and partly because parts of the collection were later noted as missing when it was catalogued and eventually shipped to Belgrade, where most of it now forms the core of the Nikola Tesla Museum. Those gaps remain genuinely unexplained. What they do not do is prove that a working global power system was quietly carried out of that hotel room in a trunk. What actually happened on those nights at Wardenclyffe, according to everyone who was truly there, is both simpler and more moving than the legend that replaced it. A brilliant, stubborn man built something genuinely unprecedented, misjudged what it would take to finish it, was honest about that failure only once his backer and his fortune were both gone, and was carried, in the end, not by suppression but by ordinary human limits: money, time, and the slow, patient erosion of belief. The tower is gone now, but the shaft beneath it is still there, sunk into the Long Island soil exactly where Tesla's men left it, and the laboratory Stanford White design still stands above it, being restored today as a museum funded largely by people who never stopped believing Tesla deserved a better ending than the one history gave him.